Okay, we're recording again. So I've went ahead and lubricated the piston and put it back in the cylinder. And as you can see, as I turn the crankshaft, our piston moves up and down. As it moves up and down in the top of the cylinder, it's going to open and close our ports. Now this one right here is our exhaust, and the ones on the sides are our transfer ports, as spoken about before. So as the piston is coming down in the crankcase, it creates pressure down in the primary area. At the same time, it uncovers these transfer ports in the secondary area. So the fuel and air that's under pressure here escapes, goes up along the sides, comes into our transfer ports, and then comes up into the secondary area. So how does that fuel get sucked into the primary area in the first place? Well, just as our piston is going up, as it comes down, it creates pressure. As the piston goes up in the primary area, it creates low pressure. At that point, our reed valves that we talked about earlier will spring open and allow the fuel and air to come from the carburetor into the crankcase or the primary area. So that's really the first place the fuel stops off. So our piston going up has created low pressure, and it has drawn in the fuel and air. At the same time that that is happening, as it's drawn in the fuel and air, a previous mixture of fuel and air is up top, and the piston is coming up and it's compressing that fuel and air mixture. Okay, so this is what we would call the compression event. As the piston moves up, it's an event because it's not a full stroke of the engine. So the piston moves up there towards the top, compresses a fuel-air mixture, and at top dead center or thereabouts, our spark plug will make a spark and ignite the fuel-air mixture and push the piston back down on not what would be a power stroke, but a power event. Because remember, a stroke has to be the entire distance that the piston moves. And technically, it's not a power stroke on a two-cycle because approximately halfway down, as we look into the cylinder, our exhaust port becomes uncovered and lets the exhaust out. So that's our power event. The fuel is ignited, it's pushed the piston down. Meanwhile, down below, as the piston's coming down, it's pressurizing the crankcase again. So our piston comes down, exhaust opens, our exhaust leaves, and then our transfer ports open up, and our pressurized fuel and air from down below comes up or on, and the cycle starts over and over. And this happens obviously very, very fast. Two-cycle engine can run anywhere from 750 RPMs up to about 9,000 or 10,000 RPMs, or this can happen 9,000 to 10,000 times in a minute, so it's pretty fast. So a couple things to remember. Your primary area, that's the first place that the fuel and air comes into. The secondary is the area above the piston. We also want to remember that in a two-cycle engine, we don't have, like a four-cycle engine, excuse me, we have an intake stroke, we have a compression stroke, we have a power stroke, we have an exhaust stroke. In a two-cycle engine, it's not a stroke, it's an event because the piston doesn't move the full distance. So what's going on is we have an intake event where on a four-cycle engine, the intake event or the intake stroke happens with the piston moving down, whereas on a two-cycle engine, the intake event happens when the piston moves up. So we have the intake event. At the same time we have the intake event, we have the compression event because our piston is moving up in the cylinder. Once we get to the top and our spark happens, we now have a power event. Our power event is pushing the piston back down until our exhaust port is uncovered, and then all our exhaust gases leave. At the same time we have a power event, we're gearing up for what would be a transfer event, which is when our piston comes all the way down Well, we have the exhaust event, then we have our intake event, our transfer event. Pistons all the way down bottom. Transfer ports are uncovered. The transfer event takes place and our piston starts back up, creating an intake event in the primary area while we're having a compression event in the secondary area. Okay? Now, the other thing that I want to touch bases on here briefly are the different types of valves that a two-cycle engine will have. I'll start with the third one, which is almost non-existent anymore, and it's a rotary valve. Okay? The way this would work is you would have a rotating disc right here, and you would have a carburetor going in from the side. The rotating disc would have a hole in it, and it would be timed so that that hole passed the carburetor when our piston was all the way up top, and we had very low pressure in the crankcase. That will allow the crankcase to draw fuel and air in. Then that rotary valve would go past there and close that hole off. That would be the operation of a rotary valve. This engine happens to be a combination of a piston valve and a reed valve engine. Piston valve because, as you can see as you look in here, as the piston passes the port, that is our valve which opens and closes the port to let the exhaust out. So that's called a piston port or a piston valve. Every time that's down, the port's open, lets the exhaust out. Same with our intake or our transfer ports. Piston comes down and lets the intake charge come from the primary area or the crankcase up into the cylinder. The third type is known as a reed valve engine. These are our reeds. So this engine is a combination of two of them. We have the piston valve and we have the reed valves. As I've said before, the reeds, when the pressure is low inside the crankcase, atmospheric pressure forces these open and our air and fuel rushes in. So basic components, two-cycle engine, much simpler than a four-cycle engine. We have seals on the crankshaft to prevent air leakage. We have our bearings, we have our crankshaft, our connecting rod, and our piston. Just a quick review. So our piston, our rings, rod, crankshaft, bearings, seals to make sure that no air gets passed, because we certainly don't want any air leaks on a two-cycle engine. That would be very, very bad. They will not run well when they're leaking air. So we have our piston, rod, crankshaft. We have our crankcase, which in this case is two-piece. We know about the transfer ports within the cylinder. We know about the exhaust ports within the cylinder. There's no porting in the head. Here's our head, simple design. Okay, that concludes this video, and thanks for watching.